ambitions stirred within the U.S. well before the 1890s, as we've discussed, but it was a war with Spain in 1898 that made those stirrings a reality. This war transformed America's relationship with the world and left it with a far-flung empire. Now, the war emerged out of events in Cuba, which together with Puerto Rico were all that remained of Spain's empire in the Americas. Cubans had been resisting Spanish rule since at least 1868, when they began a long but ultimately unsuccessful struggle for independence. Many Americans naturally sympathized with the Cubans during this 10-year struggle, trying to fight off their colonial masters. Of course, that resonated with Americans, but the U.S. did not intervene. In 1895, the Cubans rebelled again. Although their goal was to end Spanish rule, the island's problems were in part a result of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff of 1894, tariff passed during Cleveland's administration that raised duties on sugar and devastated Cuba's economy, which was dependent on sugar. Economic havoc and poverty increased social unrest, and so they rebelled again. The brutality on both sides of this rebellion shocked Americans. Some Cubans adopted a scorched earth policy to repel the Spanish, while the Spanish commander, General Valeriano Weyler, confined civilians in what were now called concentration camps, concentrating the enemy, where they died by hundreds from malnutrition and disease. He became known as Butcher Weyler. The Spanish had used these same methods during the early rebellion without shocking Americans, but now they were widely and sensationally reported by the press, who usually ignored the brutality on the Cuban side. Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World and William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal were creating a new kind of newspaper that openly catered to a broad popular audience of lower socioeconomic status than the traditional press had done before. You'll recall the number of publications was proliferating, and literacy was proliferating as part of the new urban society, but not necessarily the quality of this added media. They specialized in lurid and sensational news and were not even above creating it. More traditional journalists referred to this as yellow journalism. In the 1890s, Pulitzer and Hearst were engaged in a fierce circulation war and saw the Cuban rebellion, as a great opportunity. It may be apocryphal, untrue, but Hearst is reported to have said, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." There was a growing population of Cubans in the U.S., and they gave extensive support to the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which was headquartered in New York City. They helped popularize the leader, Jose Marti, who was killed in 1895. Later, Cuban Americans formed clubs and associations to support the cause of Cuba Libre, Free Cuba. In some areas of the country, these efforts were as important as yellow journalism in generating popular support for the revolution. Despite the mounting storm of indignation, Grover Cleveland did not support American intervention in Cuba. He proclaimed American neutrality and urged New York authorities to stop the agitation by the Cuban refugees there. He did formally protest Spain's conduct, which alarmed the Spanish, who then recalled Weyler. Now, by the end of 1897, the insurrection was losing ground, and Spain had offered a qualified autonomy. Two things happened, however, in February of 1898, that same month, that dramatically heightened tensions. First, a private letter by Dupuy de Lome, the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., was printed in which he called McKinley a weak man and a, quote, bidder for the admiration of the crowd. Now, this was no huge thing. It was a private letter, and it wasn't like he was calling him, an a-hole or anything. He just said he was kind of weak and a populist. Teddy Roosevelt had said, in fact, that McKinley had no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. But nevertheless, it was a brouhaha, and Dupuy de Lome was recalled. Second, the American battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, which was there to protect American interest. Killed more than 260 people. A naval court of inquiry hastily and inaccurately concluded that the explosion came from an external source. This created war hysteria. Remember the Maine became the war cry. Congress unanimously appropriated $50 million for military preparations. McKinley still hoped to avoid a conflict, but many in his administration, including the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a fairly insignificant guy named Teddy Roosevelt, clamored for war. In March of 1898, McKinley asked Spain for an armistice, negotiations for a permanent peace, and an end to the concentration camps. Those three things. Spain agreed to stop fighting and close the camps, but refused to negotiate with the rebels and reserved the right to resume fighting if necessary. Since they didn't completely meet the demands, McKinley on April 25th asked for and received a congressional declaration of war. Again, this was made possible by highly sensationalizing these events, particularly the destruction of the Maine. Here we see one of Hearst's papers published this artist's rendition of the Maine. You see this guy here, these people being blown up here, like this guy right here. And he's like, ah, and who knows what it really looked like. Thus ensued what Secretary of State John Hay would famously call a splendid little war. Most Americans agreed. Declared in April, the war was over in August, partly due to the fact the Cuban rebels had greatly weakened the Spanish. The U.S. effort was really a mopping-up exercise. Only 460 Americans were killed or wounded in battle. 5,200, however, died from tropical diseases. Cuban casualties were, of course, much higher. Despite this seemingly great success, the American war effort was beset with problems. There was a shortage of modern rifles and ammunition. The uniforms were too heavy for tropical use. There were grossly inadequate medical services, limited and horrible food. The regular army only numbered 28,000 troops and officers, most of whom were adept at suppressing Indian outbreaks on the plains, not large-scale warfare. This meant that as in the Civil War, the government had to rely on National Guard units commanded by local leaders without military experience. The entire mobilization was remarkably inefficient. Racial conflicts were also a significant problem. A significant portion of the U.S. invasion force was black. Some were volunteers from local communities, though some Southern governors forbade this, and some were for the 4 black regiments in the regular army, professional soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers. By the way, the oldest Buffalo soldier died in 2005. He was 111 years old. He's buried in Arlington. As these regular soldiers were transferred east to invade Cuba, they passed through the segregated South, and they didn't like the restrictions. Some defied Jim Crow openly. In Tampa, there was a riot that left 30 people wounded. Racial tensions continued in Cuba itself, where American blacks played crucial roles and won many medals. This is going to be one reason they're going to be so angry at not being allowed in combat during World War I. And nearly half the Cuban rebels were black, and these were fully integrated into the rebel army. One of the leading rebel generals, Antonio Maceo, was black. No agency in the U.S. military had clear authority over the strategic planning, unlike today. This is a weakness that became very clear in this war. Only the Navy had a clear objective, and it had little to do with Cuba. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, was an ardent imperialist, a warmonger, and seemed unaware of the complete unimportance of his position. As a prelude to war, he strengthened the Navy's Pacific Squadron and instructed its commander, Commodore George Dewey, to attack Spanish naval forces in the Philippines in the event of war. Immediately after war was declared, Dewey steamed to Manila and on May 1st completely destroyed the very old Spanish fleet there. Only one American sailor died, and that was of heat stroke. And Dewey became the war's first hero. He was immediately promoted to admiral. Several months later, an American expeditionary force arrived and the Spanish surrendered Manila. Few Americans seemed to note at the time that the character of the war was changing. A war to free Cuba had become a war to strip Spain of its colonies. No consideration, had been given to what the U.S. would do with these possessions that it was acquiring.